who's had a good week?
Well, as we already mentioned, there was an election bonanza in Europe this past weekend in Poland, Portugal, and Romania, where we're going to be heading to in a bit. But it was also Europe's biggest election. The election with the most voters in the largest amount of countries. Of course, it was the Eurovision Song Contest.
Of course.
And I couldn't let a song contest go by without at least a bit of a debrief. So I'm giving my good week to Austria, who won last weekend's Eurovision for the first time since Conchita Wurst won in 2014. They beat the pre-show favourites of Sweden with a song called Wasted Love by the 24-year-old singer Pietsch, a singer who blends opera and pop. You were watching, right, Katy? What did you make of it this year?
Do you know what? This was one of those years where I was like, oh, I'm really tired. I'll just watch like 5 minutes. And then, as always, it's so fun and stupid and weird. And I was having such a good time following the snarky internet commentary that I ended up staying up way too late for somebody that has a small baby. So I had a good time, as always. I will say I don't think this was my favourite year for songs. I think there were a lot of mid songs that were like, fine. No huge favourites.
Yeah, I'm the same. I really don't think it was the best crop of Eurovision songs. I was actually tempted to make this segment a bad week for breath control because there were so many people singing sharp and not being able to relax their diaphragms properly.
It must be hard for you watching this as a professional. Like, I don't notice this stuff. I'm just like, this is stupid and fun.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I have sympathy for them all because it is such a huge stage in front of so many millions of people. I think I also probably wouldn't have very good breath control in that situation. But yeah, I thought there were some fun songs. I liked the kind of amphibious tailed singing newt ladies of
the
Latvia.
Latvians.
Yeah.
They were good. Yeah, I like them too.
I also, of course, loved Finland's Erika Vikman with her not particularly subtle song, Ich komme.
She was robbed. That was the best fun. And like, she had this mad performance where she had to, be dangling in the air from a giant microphone. It was impressive.
Yeah, I also think she was robbed. The presenters were also great. It was as mad and camp as usual. And I had that annual intense feeling of being part of a European community in a way that I only really get when watching Eurovision or when we've organised a live show of our own podcast.
Yeah, me too. I do wonder what you actually make of the winning song. I mean, if there's somebody on this team who is an opera expert, it's not me. I didn't love the singing. He was just this warbling in a really high-pitched voice while on a boat. He just seemed like he was in trouble on a boat and they didn't get it. But he does have this obviously operatic training, JJ. Did he have a good technique?
Well, he's got a really full and incredibly impressively high voice for a countertenor, or maybe he's even a male soprano. I personally don't love the song or his singing, but I am really happy for him. And he's clearly a very virtuosic vocal performer, and he clearly does have quite good breath control.
Well done.
He actually studies with a really quite famous and celebrated Wagnerian soprano called Linda Watson in Vienna. But yes, JJ is the real deal. He's actually sung in a few productions at the Vienna State Opera, which is one of the most respected opera houses in the world. And actually, we don't know yet which city will host Eurovision next year, but I have a wild card idea.
Go on.
Why don't they host it at the Vienna State Opera?
How many people does that hold?
Not enough.
Okay.
It's clearly not as big as the stadiums, and everyone would have to scale down their set pieces. Fewer people would be able to be there in person. But wouldn't it be cool to do a Eurovision where everyone is accompanied by the Vienna Philharmonic?
Ooh.
It would be like an amazing mashup of high and low European culture. It would bring Eurovision back to its roots, where there was always a live orchestra. And it might be cheaper than doing it in a stadium, which might be necessary because apparently Austria's broadcaster are in some pretty serious financial trouble at the moment and are quite concerned about spending the estimated 30 million euros it's expected to host.
Is that how much it costs? Oof.
Yeah, but in all honesty, I actually think Eurovision does feel like it needs a bit of a shake-up. And I think I would go as far as saying as Eurovision is in a bit of a state of crisis or a state of disrepute, depending on how you look at it, due to the continued involvement of Israel in the competition. A country that is committing genocide, according to countless NGOs and genocide specialists, and even a special committee of the United Nations. There were, just as there were last year, protests in the host city, this time of Basel, against Israel's involvement in the song contest. There were actually two people who attempted to throw paint within the stadium during the grand final on stage during Israel's performance and, got into a kerfuffle with some security guards. And
I have to say, it was really strange. Watching it on television, you had no sense that there was anything going on. It looked very smooth. And, we saw no Palestinian flags waving when afterwards...
We did.
Oh, did we? On TV?
Yeah, well, at least in the semi-finals, I spotted some quite prominent Palestinian flags. Audience members were allowed to bring Palestinian flags in.
Okay, interesting. I didn't spot any. And it felt like what we were seeing on the screen didn't quite match the reality. And that, to me, felt political. I know there's this whole thing of like, politics shouldn't get involved, so Israel should be allowed to still be there. But them being there at this point is a political choice, I feel. So it felt really, really strange.
Yeah, and if they have that anti-booing technology, which we've talked about on the show before. So even if the audience are booing a certain act, and in this case, it seems like they were booing Israel, you don't hear it at home.
Yeah. But I saw that some of the national broadcasters who are part of the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, that organizes Eurovision, they had raised questions over Israel still being part of this competition, right?
Yeah, they did. The broadcasters from Ireland, Spain, and Slovenia had all questioned Israel's involvement in advance. And the Spanish broadcaster was actually threatened with punitive fines after its commentators mentioned the victims in Gaza during their commentary for the contest's second semi-final. The Spanish broadcaster, however, did not back down. They put up a statement for 16 seconds before their coverage of the grand final that read, "When human rights are at stake, silence is not an option. Peace and justice for Palestine." Mm-hmm. So Spain could be facing some quite hefty fines from the European Broadcasting Union.
And just to clarify, why is what they did, the Spanish broadcaster, why is that against the rules?
Well, the EBU referred to this long-running principle that you mentioned, that Eurovision is supposedly a non-political event. Mm-hmm. The official rules state that broadcasters have a responsibility to make sure the competition is not politicized. But keeping the event strictly non-political is something that, in reality, has always been a struggle. Politics in its many different forms often finds a way to creep into the contest. And as you suggested already, many people would argue that it's a political statement allowing Israel to compete. There was also significant pushback just before the competition started when more than 70 former Eurovision performers delivered a letter to the European Broadcasting Union calling for Israel to be removed from the competition in solidarity with Palestine. The letter accused Israel's public broadcaster Kan, who represent Israel at Eurovision, of being complicit in Israel's genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. And they said, "We believe in the unifying power of music, which is why we refuse to allow music to be used as a tool to whitewash crimes against humanity." Mm.
Did the EBU actually respond to this letter? Have they said anything?
Yeah, they did. They said that they understand the concerns and deeply held views around the current conflict in the Middle East. And they said that the contest remains at its heart a universal event that promotes connections, diversity, and inclusion through music. Mm. They also state that the EBU is an association of public service broadcasters, not governments. Public service broadcasters who are all eligible to participate in Eurovision each year if they meet the requisite requirements. They say, quote, "It is not our role to make comparisons between conflicts."
Comparisons between conflicts. I mean, that's presumably a reference to the fact that they did decide to kick Russia out of the competition in, when was it, 2022, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, right? What is behind this different treatment for Russia and Israel, do you think?
Well, they are, of course, completely different situations. They're just isn't up until now the same consensus in Europe that Israel should be excluded from these kind of events, at least not amongst our politicians.
Yeah.
In fact, quite the opposite. I actually saw that quite a few members of the Dutch government were cheering on the Israeli contestant on Twitter during the final. If you think back to the Russia situation, Russia were kicked out when there was a widespread consensus from politicians across the political spectrum, across so much of Europe, that Russia needed to be stopped, to be ostracized, excluded, and isolated. If the EU, or even if a large chunk of the countries that take part in Eurovision, were putting up sanctions against Israel, which many people believe they should, then it would immediately open the door to Israel being kicked out of the competition. But nothing like that has happened yet. So I don't think it's that surprising that it hasn't happened. There was this week, however, a very high-profile person that came out and called for Israel to be pushed out of Eurovision. The Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez. He was, I think, the first leader of a European country to say so. He said that culture must not have double standards, and he brought up the Russia example. So maybe this is the beginning of a wave of high-profile calls for Israel not to be in the competition next year, but I'm skeptical that's going to happen immediately, although who knows what will happen now that Israel are launching an intense ground offensive in Gaza after 11 weeks of not allowing aid to get in.
And a situation on the ground that is just getting more horrific by the day.
Yeah.
I mean, I was actually pretty shocked. I woke up the next morning. I didn't stay awake for the results. I watched all the performances and then promptly fell asleep. But I was amazed to wake up and find that Israel got like super close to winning, right? They came second overall. They actually won the public vote. Is this really like a reflection of how Europeans feel about Israel? Like, what just happened?
Yeah, so just to quickly explain for the Eurovision virgins out there, the current Eurovision rules are that half of their votes are cast by national juries of industry professionals, and the other half come from the general public. So the Israeli song came 14th in the jury votes, but Israel won the public vote by quite a high margin. The Israeli song was a song called New Day Will Rise, sung by a survivor of the October the 7th attacks, Yuval Raphael. She was at the Nova Sukkot Gathering Music Festival when it got attacked on October the 7th and had an absolutely horrifying experience.
Yeah.
But the fact that Israel won the public vote was, I think, quite a surprise for quite a lot of people because, well, maybe it's a subjective thing to say, but I don't think it was one of the best songs, despite Yuval's harrowing personal story.
I mean, what do you think explains why Israel did so well with the public vote?
Yeah, that was something I really wanted to work out after these results came out, because I was one of those people that thought, whoa, I really must live in a bubble if apparently Israel is getting so much support from the public at a time when so many people around me in my life are considering boycotting Eurovision or actually boycotting it because of Israel's involvement. I've seen that some of the media are indeed framing it like this, that these results are an indicator that the pro-Palestinian movement in Europe is smaller than you think, and that Israel has more support amongst Europeans than the media lead you to believe. But I don't buy this framing. And I listened to a fascinating interview with pollster Kevin Cunningham on Ireland's RTE radio channel, undermining that framing by really diving into the data. He said that based on the data they have from previous years, only about 6 to 7% of Eurovision viewers actually vote. So he says we have to think about motivated reasoning, something that occurs in elections with very low turnout, that the people who are most motivated or most interested have a bigger influence. This is even more the case in Eurovision than real political elections, because in Eurovision you can vote up to 20 times with each payment method you have. So if you are highly motivated to vote, you can have an outsized influence on the result.
And especially in a year like this year where, you know, I voted in previous years and I didn't vote this year because there just wasn't a song that I felt super strongly about. Yeah,
that's true. And that's another thing he talks about, which is this idea that there are diffuse alternatives. That if you're really going there to show support for Israel, then you give your vote to that one country. But for people who want to show support for Palestine, for example, if they really are voting politically, there's no clear alternative for them to vote for.
Right.
Another thing that was really interesting from his interview was that he pointed out from historical data that An act that comes in around second usually gets about 13 to 14% of the votes cast. So it might be a bit more in this case because Israel came first in the public voting, but still, if it's somewhere roughly in the region of 14% of the people who voted, you have to realize a large proportion of voters are voting for others, and an even larger proportion of viewers are not voting at all.
And as you said, the jury result for Israel was much lower than its public vote, right? So the professionals clearly didn't agree with the public on this.
Yeah, and it's the second year in a row that that's happened, that Israel's jury vote is significantly lower than the vote it gets from the public. And because of that, there are now calls from a number of countries for there to be an examination of whether the current televoting system is functioning, including from the broadcasters of Finland, Spain, Belgium, and Iceland. And another thing that's worth mentioning about Israel's success with the public vote is that there is evidence for the second year running of a big paid advertising campaign supported by Israeli state institutions.
Oh, really?
Now, I should point out that doesn't seem to be against the rules, and it's not totally unusual. Apparently, the UK had a really successful paid campaign when Sam Ryder came second in Eurovision a few years ago. And Malta also invested quite a lot of money this year, but not very successfully. But the fact that the Israeli candidate has been so successful 2 years running with the public has raised questions about this campaigning. And Eurovision specialist Catherine Baker has found evidence to suggest that the Israeli entry appears to have been supported by a larger scale state-sponsored digital advertising campaign than any other entry in Basel. And yeah, because people can vote 20 times, if they are really motivated to do so or convinced to do so by an advert, mobilizing just a small fraction of viewers to vote those 20 times can make a huge difference with the results.
I mean, the paid operation, this is starting to sound a little bit like the Romanian election here, more on which later. But I mean, between that and the fact that people can vote 20 times and that, a small number of people are going to do that for Israel, in conclusion, you're basically saying there's a bunch of stuff with the way that Eurovision's democratic process works that needs fixing.
Yeah, I guess I am, or at least I'm convinced by many clever Eurovision analysts who are also saying that.
Can we go back for a second to the question of Israel's involvement in general in the competition? You mentioned that EBU broadcasters might struggle to reach a consensus over kicking out Israel unless there is a broader political consensus within Europe on sanctioning Israel, and that frankly feels quite far off in Europe right now. Are there any other reasons why they might not want to kick out Israel? Is there something else going on here?
Yeah, interesting question. A lot of people write online that Eurovision might not be taking seriously the idea of kicking out Israel because one of Eurovision's main sponsors is Moroccan Oil, which is an Israeli-owned company.
This is the hair care brand, right?
Exactly, yeah. And I can't really comment on that because there is no evidence I've seen that is the case in EBU's internal decision-making. There is, however, one other interesting reason why the EBU could be reluctant to kick out Israel. And this one I learned about from an excellent YouTube short on the Overthinking It channel. And that is the argument that the EBU could be keeping Israel in Eurovision in order to keep Israel's Can broadcaster as a public independent news organization. Now, this is a bit complicated, but in order to be a member organization of the EBU, you have to meet certain standards of journalistic independence. And there are some that believe that if Israel is kicked out of Eurovision, Can would be shut down by the government. So some people are saying EBU is protecting Can, but then other people say, yeah, well, Can is already not doing great journalism when it comes to covering the war in Gaza. So if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of that, then I'll share a link to that short in the show notes. It's a really good explanation and a piece of nuance around why Israel may be being kept in the competition.
Interesting.
That people maybe don't realize.
I do also wonder whether there might now be a deeper conversation within the EBU about Israel being still a part of this competition. Because it is crazy how close Israel came to actually winning this thing, right? And that would have just looked really, really bizarre, I think.
Yeah, indeed. As I said, I'm skeptical that the EBU will do anything unless something changes significantly in the geopolitical context. But I guess there is a world where enough public broadcasters could start placing enough pressure on the EBU to form a consensus to kick Israel out, even without that happening. And I mean, as we mentioned, things are getting more and more gruesome in Gaza by the day. Over 53,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel since October 2023. And it does feel like we are at a bit of an inflection point. More European politicians are standing up and distancing themselves from the Israeli government, some even daring to accuse Israel of genocide. And this happens just as Netanyahu and his far-right cabinet become bolder in their statements and Israel's goals of the war become ever more violent. If Israel had won the competition, which it nearly did, the Song Festival would have been in a huge crisis. And I was speaking to some people who said maybe Israel should have won. Maybe that's what needed to happen in order to help this competition and the organizers realize that Israel hosting a song festival is not an option after all they've done and continue to do in Gaza.
Sorry, this was a good week.
Yes, sorry, I got distracted. Shall I end this by giving you some fun cheering statistics from this year's competition to make it feel a bit more like a good week?
Oh, please do.
Okay, this year's competition had songs in more languages than ever before. 20 languages were sung on the main stage. We had Montenegrin, Icelandic, and even the Geg dialect from Albania. And whilst the winning song was in English, songs that were not in the English language did really well. Of the 5 songs that didn't qualify in semi-final 1, they were all fully in English. Ha! So don't sing in English, sing in your own language. And I think it's great to see that Europe is so open to listening to songs in other languages.
Yeah, also people singing in each other's languages. Like I was quite happy to see, the Dutch guy singing in French a little bit, for example.
Yeah, and Finland singing a bit in German. My only plea to the organisers, apart from putting it in the Vienna State Opera next year, is to subtitle more songs, just like Italy did this year. I mean, I want to know what people are singing about.
Oh, yeah, I wondered if we actually got to read that because it was Italy who chose to do it.
Yeah.
I really appreciated being able to read the words, which were actually quite beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. They should do it more often. Anyway, that's it. That was apparently a good week for Austria.
Well done.